Welcome to Simplify to Scale, a show dedicated to helping you scale a high impact and high profit business that you love without all of the complexity and chaos that can keep you trapped in the day-to-day. I'm your host, Krista Grasso, and with decades of scaling experience, I know what actually works and what's just hype. So if you are done with all of the one-size-fits-all scaling advice and all of the overnight success promises, and instead you want proven practical strategies that will help you simplify operations, elevate your leadership, amplify profits, and scale sustainably, let's dive in and get started. Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Simplify to Scale show. Today, one of the things I want to share is a little bit about the story of how I got to where I am today. And the reason I want to share this is I think sometimes we think we need to have it all figured out. And there's these things that happen along our path and along our journey that at the time can sometimes feel like a misdirection. It can feel like things aren't working out the way that we want them to. We can sometimes feel some regret about the decisions that we're making. And in the end, they are all the things that lead you on the path that you may not have been able to envision when you first started. If you think back to the very first vision that maybe you had for your business, I know some people who don't even really have the ability to form a vision for a little bit until they're in their business because it is so emerging. But if you think about where you are today versus where you thought you might have been when you very first started, I bet there's so much that happened that may be different than, or bigger than, or more impactful than what you originally saw for the business. And in a few episodes ago, I shared a little bit about the future casting exercise that I did at our Propel retreat in December, where we were planning for the year. And there's this trend that's going around online right now where people are sharing their photo dump and what they were doing back in 2016, so 10 years ago. And that's what I did in the future casting episode, where we looked back and really started to envision like what could be possible 10 years from now when we consider all of the things that have happened in these past 10 years. But as I've been sharing the story with people, I've been getting a lot of questions. People have really been curious, and I realized how few people actually know the story of how I got started and how I got to where I am today. So I thought I'd share that a little bit with you today. So first things first, I'm going to actually start before 2016, and then we're going to go back because the very first businesses I led were actually in the early 90s. It was like 1992 through 1996 timeframe. And I actually, fun fact, led the first ever espresso bar in the state of Connecticut and the first ever drive-through coffee shop in the state of Connecticut, which if you remember back to, or depending on where you're at in your journey, if you were even alive during the 90s, if you remember the old school photo booths that used to be the drive-through photo booths, I converted one of those into the first drive-through coffee shop in the state of Connecticut. And this was, I think it was 1992 or 93 that I had done this. And so the Java Bar and the Grind were the two coffee shops that I led at the time. I did not actually start them. I didn't found them. There was somebody who had come from Seattle and he had started them and he hired me at the very first one that he had opened up, which was in the lobby of a hospital. And I had stepped in just getting a job. It was I think one of the first jobs that I had aside from being a babysitter and a paper girl and, like the little things that you do when you're 13, 14, because I've always worked most of my life. But that being said, so I took on the job and very quickly I stepped right into management. I was the one who was leading the entire business. I was hiring out the team. I was the one who did all of the operations and all of the financials and all of the ordering and all of the tracking. And really, I ended up running the business so much so that he completely stepped back from the business. And then at some point, he decided that he and his family were actually going to go back to Seattle. He was from Seattle, had come to Connecticut, and had brought this idea with him. And so my very first experience first growing and then scaling a business was actually these coffee shops. And at one point in time, him and his family picked up, went back to Seattle, and he left me with both businesses, his car, his house, and his checkbook. And I had full reign to completely lead the businesses. Now, keep in mind, I was in high school and I was in college. So I had very much a full time commitment, if you will. I mean, school kind of feels like a job, but I had a full time commitment. When I was in college, I was away at college. So I managed this and I managed the team and I managed things remotely. So I had to get really good at hiring good people. I had to get really good at setting clear processes and systems and instructions to make sure that the coffee drinks got made properly, things got ordered on time, vendors were paid on time, like all of the different moving pieces, that all of those things happened because I couldn't physically be present from open till close 7 days a week. First of all, that wouldn't be good for anybody to do, but I had other commitments. I had other jobs because that was just what I did. That was how I rolled. I always had like 2 or 3 jobs growing up. And on top of that, I was in school full time. And so it really taught me so much. But one of the very first things that I noticed was he brought this idea in, and it was a very visionary idea at the time. Right now, you're kind of like coffee. But keep in mind, at the time, like Dunkin' Donuts couldn't even spell espresso. There wasn't a single Dunkin' Donuts on earth that even sold espresso. Starbucks had espresso, and that was like a really big thing. I ended up actually managing a Starbucks for many years. I managed one in Boston, and then I managed one in Connecticut when I was younger, also while I was in college and right after. But that being said, like that had not existed at the time that I had done this in the state of Connecticut. It was after that that it got added. And so people would come in and they just wanted a regular cup of coffee. They were intrigued by the idea of espresso drinks. They didn't get that an Americano was kind of the same thing as a cup of coffee. They just straight up wanted a cup of coffee. And he was very, no, no, it's got to be espresso. He was very kind of particular about it because he was trying to bring this idea of espresso to the state. And so he was ahead of his time. Again, it sounds kind of crazy now when I say that because now coffee and espresso drinks are so common. But back then, it was not a common thing. And so he really resisted the idea of regular coffee. He wanted to be different. He didn't want to be like other coffee shops. And so I really convinced him that not only were we going to have regular coffee, but we were going to have flavored coffee. And again, I know as I say this, you're probably like, really? But back then, that was not really a thing. People didn't really have flavored coffee. And so I had brought in all of these different flavors of coffee, and I would do these great things where I would say what flavors were going to be on what day of the week. And I would make all of these incredible different drink concoctions and Italian sodas and what is kind of like a frappuccino, you could say from a Starbucks lens. But at the time, I don't even remember what I called it. It was some kind of like coffee milkshake or something that I had made. And so I'd done all of these incredible things. And first I grew the business, but then I scaled it. But the first lesson that I learned is it's great to have vision. It's great to have an idea. It's great to be shifting things and to be expanding people's idea of what they want and what's possible. But you also have to meet people where they're at. And saying, well, I can pull you a shot of espresso and I could add water and it's called an Americano and it's basically the same thing as a cup of coffee. That did not feel like a cup of coffee to somebody. They were like, no, I just want you to do a drip cup of coffee for me. Could you just give me a cup of coffee? And so I gave them a cup of coffee and then I took what they already knew and I made it fancy by giving them flavored coffee and giving them flavors of coffee that they had never really had before. Like Irish cream was my all-time favorite. So I always had Irish cream as a standard one. The only flavors people had ever really heard of back then were like vanilla and hazelnut. Even Irish cream was like this rogue idea. But then, layer in some of the fancy flavors and things that I had mixed in. And everyone was so curious and they wanted to know what we were doing. And we got a lot of buzz. And then being the first drive-through, we got a lot of buzz. And so I leveraged the novelty and the newness and the curiosity to really grow and expand that brand quite a bit and to grow and expand our customer base. And we, in the beginning, I think in the first 6 months alone, it might have even been 4 months. It was a very short period of time. I more than doubled the amount of revenue that was coming in. And then I started looking at, well, how can I take this? It's great. I doubled the revenue, but how do I make this more profitable? And I started increasing the profitability. I started looking at, we were wasting so much on coffee and at food and things that people weren't eating or weren't drinking. And I started to look at what were the things that we sold through and the things that we didn't. And I started adjusting what we were doing so we had less waste in the business. And I mean, when I think about the things that I do now, I really cut my teeth on so much of that in that business. And I had led other businesses. I managed a bakery, I managed a deli. I mean, I worked full time from the time I was 15. So I'd always kind of worked, and I'd worked before that. And leading just kind of came natural to me, but I was figuring so much out. And I don't think, again, because, and the interesting thing is, we are who we are. And so we just do things that come naturally to us. We just figure things out based on the way we're wired. And I don't think I recognized that my ability to just kind of see the patterns, and my ability to just run the things, and my ability to hire different people and to give them clear instructions and tell them what to do, and to be able to problem solve and all of those things that it takes to effectively run a business. I didn't realize that that wasn't just how everyone was built and what everyone did, because I only knew myself. I didn't know anyone else who ran a business. I wasn't around other business owners. I just figured it out. And over time, what happened was I ended up working, as I shared, at a Starbucks, and I had my same customers every single morning. And there was this one guy, he was my morning customer for about 4 or 5 years. I think it was about 4 years. And one morning he pulls me aside, and I just graduated college. I had gone to school for fine art. I was art major for 3.5 years. And then I started to get a little cold feet and was like, well, I kind of want to do my own thing and I want to run my own business. And maybe it would be really good if I knew how to run a business for real instead of just making this up and figuring it out on my own. And so I switched majors. I ended up graduating with a business degree. And I specifically had a degree in MIS, Management Information Systems. And I couldn't find a job. I wasn't sure what to do. I had pivoted into this at the very last minute. And I knew I wanted to run my own business. I knew I wanted to do something creative with my artistic background. And I wasn't thinking about working in a corporate environment. I wasn't thinking about ever having a job. I certainly wasn't thinking about consulting and scaling large scale businesses. Like, it wasn't even on my horizon. I wanted to be a photographer at the time, or do something jewelry related or creative, maybe paint, even though I wasn't very good at painting. I always really enjoyed it. And so I just took the job and graduated from school, and I was like, well, now what? And I had all this college debt that I needed to pay down. And so one morning, one of my morning customers, his name was Dave, he pulls me aside and he says, I don't mean any offense by this, but why are you here? And I was like, what do you mean? And he was like, you don't seem like you should be managing a Starbucks. You seem like you should be doing something else. And I said, well, yeah, I graduated with this degree, and there's been a couple interviews I've been on, and there was this one company I really wanted to work at. And both times they went to hire me, they ended up pulling the job, and I never got an offer. And wouldn't you know, as serendipity goes, that was the company that he worked at. And he offered me a job on the spot. And he said, I've been watching you work for years now. I think you'd be fantastic at this job. I'd love for you to come in, but there's a catch. And I said, okay, what? He said, I need you to start tomorrow. We have something really urgent that we need. And the only way I could get you to start tomorrow is if you come in as a consultant. And I said, okay, cool. I had no idea what consulting was. I knew nothing. I didn't really even, I mean, I barely knew enough about the company. All I knew was that they paid pretty well and they hired people who had my degree. And so I had really wanted to work there because it was one of the few companies locally that hired. And so I went in, I got paid even more than I expected. I think it was $48,000 at the time. This was 2000. So I thought I hit the lottery. It was like the equivalent of like a six-figure job for somebody at 21 or 22 or however the heck old you are when you graduate college. I don't even remember now. And so I started as a consultant with this company. And my plan had been, I was just going to work for a couple of years. I was going to pay off my college debt. And at the same time, I was going to figure out what I wanted to do with my own business and pursue something creatively. Like I said, I was a photography major, fine art major, but I specialized in photography. I thought at the time I was really into music and bands, and I had my own magazine because, of course, I needed more things to do. And I also had a fanzine called Roa that I had done for a while. And I thought, all right, you know what? I think maybe I'll be a photojournalist. I'll go travel with different bands and musicians, and I'll, take photos and I'll interview people and I'll do these great articles. And so that had been originally some of what I was thinking. And over time, I was like, maybe I don't want to be a photojournalist. I love to write. I'd won awards for my writing before I was the young author in Connecticut when I was in sixth grade. And I had placed like second place and third place a couple other years. So I'd always really loved writing. And I loved all things creative and art. And so I just wasn't quite clear on what it was. Was it photojournalism? Was it not? Was it with musicians? I loved music, but was that really what I wanted to do? I didn't know. I loved fashion. Was it maybe something with fashion? And so I didn't know. So I thought, let me work for a couple of years. I'll figure this out, pay down my debts. It'll be great. I'll get to use my degree. I'll get some real world experience. Fantastic. And so I entered into this company, and what I basically stepped into was a project management role. And that wasn't what they called me. They called me a move coordinator. What was happening was they were moving companies from one location to another location. And what was really interesting about that role when I came in was because if you think about the fact that you're moving people from one company to another person and another company, and I was the person that was leading it, I got to know every single person in that business, every person at every level. I personally talked to the most senior executives in the company, and I made sure that their move was a really smooth transition. They were able to move into their new office. They had their Wi-Fi and their computer and their connectivity and their everything working well. I made sure every single employee was effectively moved and rebadged because they needed new badges so they could access things, and there were all of these different moving parts to doing it. And again, they called it a move coordinator, but I quickly recognized, oh, this is a project management position. I'm a project manager. But again, you're going to have to kind of, if you don't remember that time, you have to rewind back. Today, it's easy for someone to get a project management job. In 2000, there were no female project managers, and there were no project managers who were in their very, very, very early 20s. It was like unheard of, completely unheard of. And so they were not calling me a project manager for a reason, but I very quickly recognized, no, I'm a project manager. This is a project management role. And so with this job, because I got to know everybody and everyone's like, you did such a fantastic job and this is incredible. And pretty much once the move is done, you pick whatever it is that you want to do in the company and we'll make it happen. Because I was a consultant, so I was only there for the move. And so they said, we want to keep you on and this is amazing. And you just pick what you want to do and we'll move you into it. So I said, great. Well, I was just doing project management. I want to be a project manager. And they absolutely thought that was the most hysterical thing I'd ever said. I kind of got the like, isn't that so cute, pat on the head kind of thing, because again, 20 something female did not jive with project manager in that company at that particular time in the market, right? And so I was like, no, 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 you just said I did the best job. We had almost no issues. Here's what happened, blah, blah, blah. I want to be a project manager. You said I could do what I wanted to do. I'm going to be a project manager. And I was just young enough and just ballsy enough and just whatever to absolutely 100% not accept any of the other creative ways that they tried to get me out of being a project manager until I eventually went to the top person in the company and I said, listen, this went really well. I was told this. This is what I want. What harm is it to give me one project and see how I do? Just give me a chance with one project. If I don't do well, I will accept the project coordinator job that you're trying to give me, which was a joke in the place where they stuck all of the women, but that's a whole different conversation. I said, but just give me a chance. Give me one project and let's see how it goes. And I knew and fully believed that I would do well with that project. And I freaking rocked that thing to the point that I ended up becoming the most requested project manager, quickly took on program management, became the person who led the largest scale programs for the company, and ended up scaling the company through mergers and acquisitions. So the company was scaling very large by buying other companies and integrating their operations and having to merge teams and merge systems and do all of these different things. And so I became the person who led that. And then I went on to lead the project management office. So I led all of the project managers. And then I moved across the division and I led the project managers across two huge companies. And then I went on to a different company and I led the project management team for an entire global division. And I had 200 project managers under me. And so this was a little bit of my evolution. And all of this I was doing was when I was consulting. And it was kind of, when I think back on it, technically I was a consultant, but I really treated it more like an employee. It was more like my job. It was my baby. It was like my identity in so many ways. But the most fascinating part of all this is I thought I was just going to do this for a couple years to pay down some debts and then start my creative business. What I never expected, and what I think can be kind of interesting, the way our path kind of twists and turns at times, is that I ended up really loving what I was doing. I was really, really good at what I was doing. And the first company that I got hired at was a company that was very into lean manufacturing. And I'd never heard of lean before, never learned it in college or anything, hadn't had any reason to be exposed to it otherwise. And so that very first engagement that I did with them, I was exposed to lean, and then I learned lean, and then I got Six Sigma certified. And then I learned how to use 5S. And lean just made so much sense to me. It just like fit the way that my brain works. And my brain is weird. I am like one part visionary, creative, ideation, super abstract thinker. And then I'm one part very structure, very system, very logical, very analytical thinker. I'm like such a weird 50-50 blend that it's like I have this constant like tug of war in my head sometimes about things. But that being said, so it really just spoke to me. It really resonated. And so I really got into a lot of lean. So not only was I doing a lot of project management, I was a very early adopter of agile practices. If you know anything about agile versus waterfall, you'll know what I'm talking about. If you don't, you can totally forget that I said that. That's a conversation for a total different day. But I was an early adopter of working in a more agile, adaptive way and really infusing lean practices where you're doing things that have super high value and super low waste. You're just really intentional with what you're doing. So everything that you're doing is designed to produce a result and to produce profit. And if you think about what you want in a small business, you want the highest amount of value with the least amount of waste, the most amount of profit, right? You want things to be very intentional for your customers to have a great experience and for the business to ultimately make the kind of impact and profit that it is in business for. And that was just the entire way that I learned to work and what I led and what I taught other project managers to do. And then what I built entire global divisions to do. And so all of this I did long before I was even 30. And so this was just kind of my upbringing. And so I did launch my creative business. I launched a jewelry business. I launched that back in 2004. I ultimately, at the time, I was toying with photography. But what I realized about myself is what I really liked about photography was the envisioning and the directing more so than the doing. I didn't like the taking and the editing and the processing and the everything with the photos. Like, I mean, I learned photography back when I literally processed film in a dark room with chemicals and produced paper and dodged and burned. And like, I was a photographer back in the old school days when there were still film cameras. And I had to, I actually, one of my jobs was managing the darkroom overnight, but I had to like actually print my own prints and everything. So different from today. But even as I started to buy my first digital camera, which I spent $800 on, and again, back in like 2000, that was like, I felt like it was like a whole, like buying a house. Like it felt like the world to me to spend $800 on this digital camera. It was one of the first digital cameras. It was so cool back then. And now I look at it and it's like, the world's crappiest pictures ever compared to what you could do just with your iPhone or your Android phone today, right? And so it's funny how things shift so much. But that being said, I realized maybe I don't want to be the photographer. Maybe I want to direct the photography and maybe I want to leverage photography, but not necessarily do it myself. And it ended up being quite convenient that I ended up marrying a photographer. And then I ended up just doing all of the creative direction. He was a far better photographer than I ever was. And he ended up taking all of the photos in the jewelry brand that I had ended up launching in 2004. It was more of a slow launch. It really started to kind of get its legs in 2006, 2007. And so while I was still consulting, I had built this incredible jewelry brand. And I had the jewelry brand actually for 20 years. I recently closed it. It's coming back to life, but that's another story. And so as I launched this brand, I was just in my glory. I got to design all day long. I got to use the creative part of my brain that I did not really use as much in my consulting. And I loved my design so much. And I started off really small, like literally kind of when you hear people with a jewelry business, I think most people picture someone sitting at their kitchen table with a bucket of beads and making some stuff that they sell for a couple bucks at like a craft fair, right? And I mean, I had like a legit global international jewelry brand that was worn by celebrities and that was in the biggest stores. And I mean, I really, really effectively scaled my jewelry business. But when I first started it, it was kind of probably what you picture when you think of someone with a jewelry business. I sat with my beads at my desk. and I made my bracelets and I made my necklaces and I would go to craft fairs and I started to kind of build a brand and I started to build a name. And then I decided I was going to take things online and I started an Etsy shop. And this was when Etsy first launched. I think Etsy launched in what, 2005, 2006 timeframe. I was one of the very first people on Etsy. I launched my first item and it sold like within seconds of putting it up. It just so happened to be like the right product at the right time. And I was like, I found it. This is going to be like my claim to fame. This is going to be amazing. I'm going to make so much money. And then I sold like nothing else for like 2 months and I had to figure out how to sell on Etsy. It was just like beginner's luck with the first piece that I sold. But I ended up building up a really successful business on Etsy. And then I launched my own website. Then I developed my own brand. And then I eventually got to the point that I was like, all right, I'm beyond this whole craft fair, making pieces myself, sitting at a table and like selling things individually and hoping somebody buys it. I want to build a real business and a real brand here. And I want to scale this and I want to scale it in a big way. And so I rebranded the business. I found a manufacturing partner out in California. I moved into designer instead of maker role. Before that, I had hired other people to make designs with me. I had actual physical location, and people would actually be the ones who would work with customers and sell the jewelry and make a lot of the jewelry. But it was still a very handmade jewelry business. And I decided I wanted to truly scale this out. So I partnered with manufacturers out in California, stepped into the designer seat, started working with influencers and ambassadors and these incredible models and just creating these beautiful photo shoots and these beautiful stories within the brand that we captured visually. I really specialized in body jewelry and festival jewelry. And just like, again, my love of music and my love of all of those experiences and travel and everything. And so that was a lot of what I did. My special sauce, my like kind of thing I was known for was foot chains. And then I expanded that into a full line of hand chains and body chains and bra chains. And just like not your kind of everyday jewelry, unless you were me. That was just what I wore every day. But your average person didn't wear it every day unless they were going to a festival or going on vacation. And so we did a lot of like wanderlust jewelry and festival inspired jewelry. And then I eventually expanded that into a full jewelry line. And it was, I love every second of it. I loved it so very much. And I hit a point when we started selling wholesale where I went from, what would have been maybe like a couple hundred pieces of jewelry that I sold in a year when I very first launched it to selling thousands of pieces of jewelry a day. And so think about the logistical shift. Of course, it was a gradual change, but I remember when I signed on with my first wholesale sales agent, and she sold, I think, 10,000 rings in her very first order that we did with her. So I had signed on with her, and it might have been the first week that we signed on with her that she did 10,000 rings with, what was the company? Wantable, I think it was called back in the day. I don't know if any of you shopped at Wantable. If you do, you might have one of my one of my rings from back in the day. But that being said, and so all of a sudden I really quickly had to figure out, again, kind of like the coffee shop, I had to figure things out. I all of a sudden had to figure out how to do this at scale. It was very easy when it was just me and my team and we had our, like in-person location. It wasn't a storefront. It was more of an in-person studio. And I would host classes and teach classes and host events. And, I'd have open hours where people could come in and shop. But it wasn't like a brick and mortar store on the street. It was more of a studio that we used and would open up for different events and different classes and things. But that being said, all of a sudden, right, my systems, my team, all of the pieces of scaling a business, it got serious. It got really serious. And I was perpetually behind, perpetually figuring things out. Sometimes I don't know how we got those orders out the door. On the days that we did, we shipped everything on time, we got it out, but we damn near killed ourselves in the process. I mean, it was like, what is happening right now? Because it scaled before I was ready for it. And I think that's what happens a lot with businesses. We want to scale so badly and we have all these big plans to scale and we wish we were scaling faster and we wish more people were buying and then all of a sudden it happens and we're like, oh my God, what are we doing? What? And so I had to like really quickly figure some of this stuff out. And at the same time, in working with these sales agents and I'm working with wholesale, right? When you're selling retail, you've got much bigger margins. You start selling wholesale and your margins are really, really slim. And in retail, still not all that great from a margin perspective. Product based businesses are brutal from a profitability perspective. But all of a sudden, you do wholesale, and I realized I don't know that I have enough margins in some cases to charge what I was charging and still make enough for it to be worth it to sell the pieces of jewelry. And at the same time, we're getting major pressure from our sales reps and from buyers that our prices need to be lower. And I chose to manufacture in the US. I wanted all of my product made in the US, very big on quality, did not want to move production overseas to China. And everyone was pressuring me to move production overseas to China. Now, at the same time, back in the day when you had a jewelry brand, you designed that brand and you bought all the product in advance and then you sold it and people hopefully bought it. And that was where you made your money back. It wasn't like over the years it shifted and you would instead design it, people would see it, they would place an order, and it would ship in like 8 to 12 weeks. They would basically be pre-ordering the product and you wouldn't manufacture until after they bought the product. Such a smart model. But back when I had first started this, that wasn't how buyers bought. Buyers expected something immediate. And so you had to have the product on hand in order to sell the product. And that meant I had accumulated a huge amount of expense. And being the creative that I was, I, of course, knew exactly what everyone wanted. And I'm saying that very much in air quotes because boy, was I not right quite often. And I still have some of that product sitting downstairs in my basement 20 something years later. This point, maybe is it considered vintage and I could probably charge more for it? I don't know. But anyway, that being said, right, very expensive learning how to scale a business in a product based business. That is part of why I specialize so much in service based businesses right now. As hard as your service based business might feel, let me tell you, it is a piece of cake compared to a product based business. And so I was going through and kind of just trying to manage all of this, and I'm getting all this pressure and I'm accumulating all this debt and I'm working around the clock. I literally developed an ulcer. I was stressed out all the time. I was barely sleeping. I was eating like crap. I was having all of these health issues. My husband and I were about ready to kill one another. Like it was just, we were at a not great place. And as much as I loved the business, as much as I loved the design and the photos and the fun creative parts of it, it was not sustainable. It was not sustainable, and honestly, I was probably pretty darn close to putting myself out of business right in those early days when I first scaled it because I didn't know fully what I was doing. I was trying to make it up as I was going along. And so I hit this pivot point where it was either close the business down or figure it the F out. This is where the name of my 90-minute strategy session, the FIFO session comes in, the figure it the F out session, because sometimes you just need someone to help you do that. At the time, I did not have anyone to help me do that. And so what I did was I took a folding table, I took a whole bunch of sticky notes, a whole bunch of markers, some flip chart paper, and I drove to a hotel and I locked myself in the hotel and I promised myself I was not leaving until I figured out a solution. And so the poor bellhop guy was probably like, what is this crazy person doing when I show up and I've got like, the thing you wheel that you normally have your luggage on? I have a folding table on it. I have like all of these supplies on it. We get into the hotel room and I'm taking pictures off the wall and I rearrange the hotel room so that I have this big space that I could put my flip chart paper up and I could put my sticky notes up. And I just locked myself in the hotel room. I think I was there about 4 days. And I was like, I am not leaving until I figure this out. And the epiphany that I had, what ended up being the whole birth of what I do now, is I realized that all this work that I was doing, consulting with what I walked you through with the project management and program management and PMO. And the whole time I'm helping businesses scale. I'm helping them bring products to market. I'm helping them redesign teams. I'm helping them rethink how they connect their vision and their strategic goals down to what actually gets done. I'm helping them, improve the business's profitability. I'm helping them make a bigger impact. I'm helping them do all the things that were the exact same things that I was struggling with in my own business. And the disconnect for me was I had taken this as this job to pay down debt initially so I could go do what I loved and pursue my passion and do my creative stuff on the side. And to me, those two things were like oil and water. I didn't get that they were actually the same thing. Like it took me that time. It took me 4 days in a hotel room and a whole lot of brainstorming and reflection to realize that I wasn't doing in my own business, the exact same thing that I was doing, all the businesses I was consulting with, and all the clients that I was working with, and all the projects my team and I were leading. And it was because I saw it as like this big corporate giant versus my creative business. And to me, they were two totally different things. And so I didn't even recognize that I was not doing the same thing in my business as the big business. And so it was that epiphany where I kind of had my duh moment. And I realized, okay, my business is not lean. My business does not have good systems. I do not have the right team supporting me. My business is not really scalable right now. It's only scalable through hustle. And we've hit the ceiling on how much we can hustle. We can't do anymore. We can't scale any further. We are done. Like we're stopped and we're bleeding money in the business, right? No more time to go, right? I'm not applying any of the principles that I put in place in these big businesses. And so I brought that back and I completely changed how we ran the business. I reduced the number of products. I laser focused in. I got much, much, much more intentional with what we were doing. I looked at the team structure. I looked at our packing. I looked at our shipping. I looked at our suppliers. I looked at our costs. I looked at our processes. I mean, like I dialed everything into the fact that I was able to keep manufacturing in the US and I was able to actually scale that business profitably. I was able to actually get it so that we were not working 100 hours a week. Like, I mean, I completely and entirely transformed things. And what I did is my lean scaling system. Of course, I didn't call it that at the time. It was more like save my business and myself system. And so I had done that. And then, of course, all these other brands are watching. And I'm watching business after business after business. And I'm doing these big, massive trade shows in Vegas and like all of these things where I'm selling wholesale and working with all these brands, watching all these businesses go out of business, failing left and right. And meanwhile, we're starting to take off and everyone's really paying attention. And they're like, how did you get into Free People? How did you get into anthropology? How did you get Paulina Rubio to wear your necklace? How did you get featured on Timeless on TV? And how did you? And so I'm getting on like, how did you work with this influencer and this model? And I'm getting all these questions. And I realized nobody else knows how to actually run a business. Like they're just doing what they do and they're loving their life and they're, chasing their dream and it's amazing. And they have no idea how to run a business. And so I started actually sharing with people what I was doing. And in the first iteration of this business, I'd actually called it Fashionably Lean. And it was because I was working with other jewelry, accessory, and fashion brands. And I realized that those types of businesses needed the operational side of things so much. They were like abundant, overflowing in the creativity side, and they were so incredibly lacking in the operational side. And it was why so many of them were going out of business. And I did that for a while, but I realized through that experience that they also, as much as they were the businesses that needed it most, they were the businesses that wanted it least. They loved creativity. They didn't want a team. They didn't want operations. They didn't want systems. They didn't want anything constricting them or confining them or, all the things that they thought and they perceived this being, which wasn't actually reality. But I thought about it. And at the same time, meanwhile, as I'm working with all of them, I'm consulting. What I have done for years now at this point in the Fortune 500 businesses is consulting. And I'm like, why don't I just work with other consultant businesses? Why don't I just work with other service-based businesses? I'm helping them too on a larger scale. What if I work with smaller consulting-based businesses? And so I pivoted and started doing that. Again, if you hear through my story just how like one thing naturally kind of led to another and none of it was planned, right? I didn't think I would love lean. I didn't think I would love consulting. I didn't even know what consulting was when I got my first consulting job. I never thought that that's what I would be doing. I never thought I'd be developing a scaling model or a lean scaling model for that matter. But it all just kind of happened and came about. And I thought I'd be working in e-commerce forever. And then I ended up realizing, no, wait a minute, service-based businesses need this too. And they're so much easier to work with. It's so much easier to actually scale a service-based business. And I know if you're like, scaling is not easy, if you're thinking that, agree, I don't like the word easy. But that being said, like scaling a service-based business, it's actually really pretty simple. Like to me, it's simple. It's simple to make it sustainable. It's why I developed the method. It's why I chose this niche to work with and to spend so much time with, because to me, it's just so clear to see what to change and what to do to make scaling so much more simple and sustainable. And so, anyway, I had pivoted my model. I rebranded to Lean Out Method. Today, it's actually Lean Scaling Co. If you did not hear, I did rebrand right at the end of 2025. And it's because my core system, the one that I've used for all this time, is the Lean Scaling system. Just made sense to rebrand to be the Lean Scaling Co., especially based on the work that I'm doing between this brand and Strategic Ops Institute, which is certifying people in the Lean Scaling system so they could use it in their consulting or fractional or right hand partnership with founders. And so that was some of that evolution over time. And I won't go too much deeper into the story, but I wanted to give a little bit of that background about how I got where I am today. And so, art major, wanted to do something creative, was all about creativity, got a job just thinking that pay down some debt, and then I'm going to leave and go do and start my creative business. Thought I was going to be a photographer, thought that I would have some photojournalist, job or start a magazine or do something. Oh, fun fact, I did start a magazine when I launched my jewelry business. Again, this is me being a visionary and being ahead of my time per usual. Is I launched the first name of my jewelry business when I moved to a manufactured line was Nearly Naked, and I launched Nearly Naked magazine. And what I quickly learned the hard way was that most of my customers shop from their desk at work, and nobody would go to a website called Nearly Naked. And therefore, I rebranded to Chris Cara, which is the name of my jewelry business still. So, lesson learned the hard way. But Nearly Naked, the whole kind of message behind that was about like stripping off everything that's not you, like really being happy in your own skin, being happy in yourself, fully expressing yourself, not having any external influence or things on it. And the magazine that I launched was the Nearly Naked magazine. And it was actually the first body positivity magazine that was out in the market. And I had that for a couple of years. And then I ended up not continuing with it just because of the amount of work that it took to do it. And I needed to put my focus on the actual jewelry arm of the business itself instead of putting so much work into being the editor in chief of the magazine and writing a lot of the magazine and producing a lot of the magazine. But that was where my photojournalism came in, is I would coordinate the photo shoot for the magazine and then I would actually write the magazine. So I kind of in a way was a photojournalist, just not in the way that I envisioned. And so again, I was a little too ahead of my time, ended up closing the magazine. And like right after I did, I think it was like Maybelline or one of the brands ended up launching some like Nearly Naked makeup line. And I was like, seriously, not that I just rebranded. And then body positivity became a whole big thing. And so I was just a little too ahead of that one and I had not stuck with it. Otherwise, things might have again taken yet another different turn. So, all of that being said, twists and turns all along the way. And all of those led me to what I'm doing today. And one of the hardest decisions I had to make, this was probably about 3 years ago now, I think, kind of all blurs together, was I put my jewelry business on hold. And as I was sharing my photos, where this all started in this conversation, I was sharing my photos from 2016. And if you go to my Instagram, you could see some photos of my jewelry, my Krista Grasso account. I shared some photo dumps of what I was doing in 2016. And I was very much deep in scaling the jewelry brand and coordinating and doing the creative direction and the styling for all of the photo shoots and designing and partnering with the different models and ambassadors and influencers that we were working with and doing collabs with all of these fashion brands. And it was like, that was my life 10 years ago and very much of what I was doing. And I started getting comments and a lot of people said, you clearly like love this. I love these photos. Your jewelry is so beautiful. Why did you stop doing it? And that was honestly, I think, one of the hardest decisions I've ever made because, God, I loved that so much. I mean, I loved that brand so much. I loved every second of it. I am an artist at heart. I am a creative at heart. Again, weird 50% right brain, 50% left brain. And so I have to have that creative outlet in a lot of what I do to balance so much of the strategy and the like systems and the critical thinking stuff that I do. And I miss that element of things quite a bit. And I'm really excited to actually be working towards something that I'm looking to bring back in 2027, not this year, because I have a very clear focus for this year. But that being said, I just looked and said, right now I'm chasing two rabbits. I've got the jewelry brand and I've got my scaling consulting, and I cannot realistically scale both. I need to pick one. And the jewelry business had so much of my focus for so long. And as much as I loved it, I felt like the scaling business, it was really taking off. It was taking off in such a big way. And at the same time as it was taking off in a big way, if you look at the profitability between the two, there's no comparison. I mean, no comparison at all. It was not a wise financial decision to put the focus on the jewelry brand versus the focus on the consulting brand. The scalability in the service-based business, based on the way I had both businesses built at the time, like just no question. And so I decided I was going to close Chris Cara, or at least close that chapter of it, and really go all in on Lean Scaling Co. at the time, Lean Out Method. And I knew I wanted to launch Strategic Ops Institute. And I knew that there was no way I could add a third thing to the mix and still give it the attention and give it the focus that it needed. I kept like tabling new designs for Chris Cara, saying, well, I'll do it after this launch and I'll do it after this. And I realized I'm just not going to do it. And I've got this like weight that's pulling me down because I feel guilt and I like feel pulled and I feel like I need to be doing this and I need to design and I need to coordinate the photo shoot and I need to call this person and see if they can do, and I need to go fly out to California and see my manufacturers. And I should really go to Rhode Island and see if the new person that I want to partner with might be. And like, it was just all of these things that were taking my focus away from the consulting business that really needed my time. And so it was such a hard decision to close it, but I closed it. Like I said, at least for that chapter of it. And it gave me the space to be able to focus in on and really scale out Lean Scaling Co., launched the Strategic Ops Institute, which I'm really excited about. I've got some really great things coming up in March. Simplify to Scale is coming back with a whole new iteration in March. I've got the next cohort of my CSOO, Chief Strategy and Operating Officer certification in March. And so I've got a lot of stuff coming. And I'm noticing that I'm starting to get a little antsy with the jewelry business. I keep dreaming about it. I keep doodling. I'm designing. I'm designing in my head. I'm designing on paper. Like, it's coming back. It's coming out. Like, I've hit that point where I can't hold it any longer. It's coming. But I also know what I have planned for this year, and I will not allow myself to be distracted this year. But it is on the agenda for 2027. And so that actually gives me a nice fire under me for some of the things that I'm doing in Lean Scaling Co. and Strategic Ops Institute this year as well, so that I can create the space to be able to do it without taking my focus and attention off of things. It's forcing me to step out of the day-to-day even deeper in my business and even further in my business so I can have the space to focus on the business without anything falling down, without losing revenue, without negatively impacting customer experience. So I'm living so much of what I teach and what I do with people in Simplify to Scale, where I help them extract themselves from the day-to-day. I am extracting myself even further from the day-to-day so that I have the space for this new iteration of Chris Cara and some of the designs that I'm really thinking through and really working through. So it's just so interesting, the winding journey that we take sometimes. And I don't know if you found this interesting or not. Most people are like, I never knew your story, and that's so interesting. And I never would have guessed. And I only know this one side of you. I didn't even know this other side of you. And so hopefully this was of value to you. You took something away from this. I would love to hear your winding story and how you got to where you are and what keeps like pulling at you and what you're feeling called to next. Send us an email at support@leanscaling.com. I'd love to actually hear your story. I do read the emails. So if you reach out to us, I'm just so curious. Every time I have conversations with people, well, obviously nobody has the same exact story. There's always some kind of similarities like, yeah, I was thinking it would be this too. And then this happened and this is where I landed. And so really I'm dead serious when I say it. Please send me your stories. I'm so curious. And I would love to hear kind of your winding road and how you got here. And with that, I will see you again next week. I hope you took something away from this episode. And we are going to be back with another interview next week. So stay tuned and I will be back with you soon. If you are a visionary founder ready to get yourself out of the day-to-day operations of your business and scale in a much more simple, sustainable way, I have just the thing. Register to join me for my Scale Simpler workshop at scalesimpler.com. In it, I break down the hidden barriers that keep you trapped in the day-to-day of your business and what to do to finally extract yourself once and for all so things do not keep coming back onto your plate. And if you're someone who partners with founders as their right-hand advisor, consultant, or fractional, I invite you to explore our scaling certification and licensing programs at strategicopsinstitute.com.